Hi guys, it's David Stone here, Billy Kubota, Reasons. Reasons for, reasons against, reasoning, reasons. I've had an email, which is great. It's the first one, but it was challenging, let's say. It's rather difficult to digest because the implication of the email was that while the writer felt that I was onto some interesting stuff, he or she wasn't sure of the gender, kind of questioned my credentials. Um, well, I say questioned. It said, "Am I qualified to to talk about these things?" I don't really know the answer to that. I'm not academically qualified in philosophy or metaphysics or in um, linguistics or in most of the things that I kind of cover, including consciousness and so I am qualified in political theory. I did get I did 3 years of a PhD. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to list um, authors, writers, thinkers that I have what I call an acquaintance with. And this is not to show off or to kind of like suggest that it makes me smarter than anybody else. It's just that I've looked at these issues for decades now, and um, I think it gives some kind of foundation. As I say, the following list is just people that I'm acquainted with. I don't know them, any of them, in depth, apart from a few that I'll mention as we go through the list. But this is to what I'm trying to do is to give you a sense of the um, scope, the breadth and depth of the thinking that has gone into the preparation for these podcasts. So I went through a list, and I'm not sure of the chronology here, but it doesn't really matter because it goes back to pre-Socratics in terms of philosophy. So this is an acquaintance with, if you like, people who have given me something in terms of my own understanding. So bear with me. It's quite a long list, and hopefully it is sufficiently varied to give you the sense that I'm not just talking from the perspective of kind of white European Anglo-Saxon kind of philosophy. And yeah, I'm on my boat. You can possibly hear people walking past. As I said in previous podcasts, as I get more familiar with the technology of doing podcasts, I will use an editor of some sort to try and improve the quality of the sound. Anyway, this episode is just about my acquaintance with various thinkers. So here we go. Thales, often um, put forward as the first real philosopher. Um, and I've been to Miletius in Turkey where he did his stuff, and his kind of contribution to philosophy was uh, apart from being the first, he was a naturalist. He took his cues from the natural world. Uh, Democ- Democritus is the first assumed author of the idea of an atomic theory of reality. That even though in this go way as go back thousands of years, they had no way of knowing um, used by the use of technology what they were talking about, but they inferred uh, Democritus and then later on the followers of Epicurus um, inferred the molecular atomic structure of reality. And I think it was from seeing things like, particles in light beam of light, you can see tiny particles, and in water or other fluids, you can see tiny little microcosms. And they kind of assume there must be something underneath that. Um, and one of the most famous exponents of the Democritus and Epicurus later on is uh, Lucretius and his The Natural Order of Things book, and it's a fabulous poem which is the first instance I've seen of a philosophy which um, supports an atheistic kind of a natural atheistic interpretation of the world, and his go-to person was Epicurus, and Epicurus um, I value enormously because Epicurus is not at all like the Epicurus that's in popular culture, which espouses personal consumption and um, happiness as the prime movers for our uh, way of life. It doesn't do that, but it's on my list. Um, Parmenides, Parmenides, nothing changes. Heraclitus, everything changes. So Parmenides is a very short, extant literature, but basically it's like the scale of things. If you pull the lens out and look at the cosmology, um, Parmenides' view is that nothing really changes. His argument is based upon this very intuitively true argument that nothing comes from nothing and nothing can go into nothing, both which I think are wrong, but it was very telling at that time that if you can't produce something from nothing, then nothing can pre-exist anything, and there's no such thing as the void. And um, in that sense, nothing does change. It's just a kind of um, expression of what exists. And Heraclitus comes along, famous for his you can't step into the same river twice. Uh, Pythagoras, hugely popular, set up a kind of cult, I think, but was the first philosopher to focus on mathematics and a form of logic. This is before Aristotle formalized um, logic, but Pythagoras was, like, I think, a precursor. I mentioned Epicurus. Then we get into the more well-known familiar figures of Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. Um, Seen as, if you like, in quotes, founding fathers of modern philosophy, but as we go forward, we'll see that I don't subscribe to that view. I think I'm more an Aristotelian than a Plato follower, simply because I think Plato's idea of the forms as abstract, and there being a kind of realm out there that's um, more real than the real world that we see, I don't think holds up to scrutiny. And the Platonic approach has lent itself to things like a belief in some people of the pre-existence of mathematics, and that maths, the task of mathematicians, is to discover what's out there in the universe. Whereas I think a more Aristotelian perspective is that maths is a creation, not a discovery. Anyway, what Aristotle does, and he's one of my go-to people, is he sets up a whole, and massively well read, but he sets up typologies. There's four versions of cause and effect. There's by divisions of in terms of biology, in terms of physics, in terms of history, in terms of politics. He sets up all these categories in which, and they're extremely useful, but they're limited because there's always more categories that are not being considered. And then I've looked at and all of this. So Aristotle is one of the ones I've looked at in some details, and I've read Plato's Republic. I haven't read anything by Epicurus or Pythagoras. I've read a little bit of Heraclitus and Parmenides. I've read Lucretius, um, so you can see some of this is like fleeting and just like by it really is by acquaintance or association and not in depth. But then we get into another period, if you like, the post Socratics, Aquinas joining up faith and reason, and then I branched out into Eastern philosophy, or Eastern Middle Eastern, um, looking at Avicenna's interpretation of Aristotle linked to Islam, um, Al-Ghazi, the incoherence of philosophy, attacking Avicenna, um, Pascal, questioning axiomatic approaches, even though I think axiomatic approaches are pretty universal. Al-Kindi, looking at knowledge, where does knowledge come through from, and ethics. Uh, Averroes, a critical rationalist, separating church and state, and talking about the universal mind. Maimonides, a well-regarded Jewish scholar and philosopher. Peter Appleyard, an exponent of nominalism and the Trinity. And nominalism is one of the things that I attack going forward. But it's basically the view that there are no general real truths. Everything is kind of like made up or a product of the mind. Augustine talks about, obviously, Augustine's religious, St. Augustine, a major exponent of the free will argument, free will, as it were, ordained by God, and uses this notion to get around some of the theodicy, the problems of evil that we will encounter going forward. I looked briefly at Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus. Duns Scotus, just loved the name. Who wouldn't? Anselm, looking at the cosmological arguments, which we will discuss later on. Hildegard, Dignaca on perception and idealism. Then some which will be much more familiar to people. William Blake on induction. Rene Descartes on dualism. Bishop Berkeley again on idealism, which we'll talk about later. John Locke, the presumption of the tabula rasa, the blank slate, in terms of setting the foundation for British empiricism. Again, this is out of sync, it's not in chronological order, but Spinoza, who I think was, for me, the closest I've got to looking at, as it were, God being not a supernatural human being, but more aligned to nature. Nature is, I think, for Spinoza, a substitute for God. I think it's Leonard Woolf who looked at practical philosophy, which I'll come back to later on. And then quite a few people who were associated in the 1760s, 1780s. This is like Enlightenment, Mr. Enlightenment, John Stuart Mill, anti-slavery people, Otto Barr, Hugoner, again out of sync, Rousseau's Social Contact, Hobbes's Leviathan, Life is Brutal Short, etc., etc. John Stuart Mill on utility, David Walker's Critique of Slavery, Hume, if you like, the key exponent of British empiricism and the author of the problem, what later became the problem of induction. Baron de Vasti, Haitian Revolution and the Critique of Colonialism. Leibniz, talking about monads and the fact that can be known in history empty space, but a proponent of a priori against the British empiricists. Kant, and the synthetic a priori, trying to, as it were, he was said to have awoken from his slumbers having read Hume, but he tries to synthesize British empiricism and European rationalism. One of the Scottish Enlightenment figures, alongside Hume and many others, was Thomas Reid, who, he's one of my other go-to people. I've read a lot of Thomas Reid and his common sense realism, what I would see as the precursor of today's direct realism. And then Hegel idealized dialectics, Marx, who tried to turn Hegel on his head by talking about dialectical materialism. So Hegel, idealism, Marx, materialism. And then quite a few people that were influential in my thoughts around racism and the slave trade. Frederick Douglass, Du Bois. Fred Douglass in 1893, around that time, was writing on anti-slavery. Du Bois on science and philosophy. Anna Julia Cooper was a black feminist. Famous phrases, when and where I enter. Claudia Jones, this is much more modern now. Black working class woman, 1940s. But then we go back to Schopenhauer. We are all one. Henry Bergson around time and free will. Nietzsche, the genealogy of morals and the death of God. Kierkegaard on existentialism. Freud, the unconscious. Freud's failure to get purchase on the idea of the unconscious as a scientific exposition. Something that ought to happen to Jung, whose views on archetypes is still persistent today, and it's reflecting people like Jordan Peterson, who we will later come to criticize. Lacan uses language as the basis of psychoanalysis. William James, a variety of religious experience. Carnap, logical positivism, was in favour for a couple of years, but then dramatically fell out of favour because it confused, if you like, the scientific method with metaphysics, and assumed that you couldn't have a logical approach to morals and ethics and that kind of stuff. Husserl, phenomenology, which I think went down a long term, but one of my go-to people is Georgi Lukács and his theories on consciousness and labour power and the division of labour. Another one of my go-to people is Merleau-Ponty, with his focus on perception and the body, not just the mind, but the body and mind as being inseparable, and which needs to be recast because today's focus on consciousness is entirely, well, it seems to be entirely divorced from the body, especially the body, as it were, in the world. So kind of like Heidegger, to stand in the world. Even though Heidegger was a fascist, he had some great ideas about the nature of consciousness and reality. It's just the way it goes. Sartre, existentialism. Simone de Beauvoir, second sex. Gadamer on hermeneutics. Saussure on structural linguistics. Albert Camus, The Will to Be Free. Bertrand Russell, The History of Philosophy. Oh, I forgot Arendt, The Banality of Evil. Russell, The History of Philosophy. Russell is a kind of follower of the British empiricist tradition. I would say that he's still a British empiricist, so he's not as bogged down in a rejection of a priorism as the British empiricists were. Frege on logicism. Frege got kind of totally torpedoed by Russell, but produced some fantastic stuff about language and logic. Wittgenstein produced the Tractatus and others, and then produced his seminal works in opposition to his first magnus opus, by looking at language as action. Wittgenstein, somebody we'll go back to many times. Weber was one of my go-to people when I was at university on bureaucracy. Ayer on positivism, later recanted his position on positivism. Carnap on morals and metaphysics. Walter Benjamin, part of the Frankfurt School. Karl Popper is one of my go-to people. I would consider myself to be a Popperian, if you like, in the sense I don't think that there's any such thing as absolute truth. Everything is contingent and contestable. And if something's not falsifiable, that's capable of being falsified, then for me it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Kuhn, Paradigms and the Scientific Revolution, E.P. Thompson on class, Adorno on cultural criticism, E.P. Wright on history and class, Althusser on structuralism, Lukács on social being, Eagleton Terry Eagleton focusing very much on the works of the younger Marx, Habermas on cultural and critical theory, Marcuse on particularly the one-dimensional man, Baudrillard on hyperreality and the simulacra, Franz Fanon, another kind of black philosopher on the humanist view of colonialism, Derrida is, I think, a lot really misunderstood, misrepresented. His greatest contribution for me is to ask the question when you're looking at any kind of exposition or text on what is not being said, not just on what's being said, but what's not being said. Foucault, again, I'm not divided by the right, but a very, very powerful use of the genealogy approach, especially on power. Gramsci on hegemony, Dewey on pragmatism, Broughty on pragmatism, Deleuze forms of control, Iris Murdoch around the conceptual apparatus that we use to come to understanding, Davidson, reason as a causal property, Putnam on the philosophy of science, and Putnam is one of my go-to people, particularly on the fact-value debate. Quine against the syntactic a priori. Chomsky, one of my go-to people, especially on innate grammar. Colin McGuinn, The Limits of Consciousness. David Chalmers on the hard problem of consciousness. Philippa Footz of Virtue Ethics, and she's the inventor of the trolley problem. Mary Midgley, Science is not the only basis of truth. Rawls, The Thought Experiment, which we'll come on to later on, but it's really basically he imagines a world, asks us to imagine a world in which we don't know who we are. We don't know if we're male, female, black or white, whatever. We don't know who we are. What kind of a world could we conceive of as being ideal? Dan Dennett claims to have explained consciousness, but obviously left a lot of loose ends. Steve Pinker, who uses a computational model. I've read massive amounts of Pinker. Agree with a lot of what he says, but also don't agree with some. John Searle, Chinese Bock and Naive Realism. I follow him to a large extent. Ave Nay, Being in the World, is also one of my go-to people in terms of my understanding of consciousness. Susan Blackmore, Against Free Will, not my favourite, but influential. Ray Tallis, Against Reductionism and Darwinitis, what he calls Darwinitis. Of all of the people in this list, he's probably my strongest go-to person. There's Suleiman Bachir Dagni, I think he's an African philosopher. Sophie Boswe Oludu is a Nigerian philosopher. Zizek, Lacanian Marxism, he's all over YouTube. Don't get on with the guy, to be really honest with you. I think, but he's got some important things to say. Vadio around truth domains, Paul Boghossian, moral realism, Jordan Peterson, who I consider to be a sophist, Sam Harris on morality, Alex O'Connor, Stephen Woodford, and Joe Foley to bring us fully up to date. So there you go. There's quite an extensive list. I haven't counted the number. It covers a vast range, and there are many others I've looked at, but in even further in passing. So things like Hindu philosophy, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, especially the kind of the scene in the Bhagavad Gita between Arjuna and the gods, and the problem of um, morality. I've also looked at Chinese philosophy again in passing, Confucius, and I've looked at quite a lot of Buddhism. My partner's a Buddhist. I've looked into Buddhist texts, uh, and but again, not in great detail, just like in passing. There's certain things that I find steer me in certain towards a certain level of engagement, or has the opposite effect. And this came from when I first got into Aristotle, which was uh, the use of typologies or groups of things, numbers of things, stages of things, always alerted me to the possibility that that exposition or conversation or account was, in some senses, made up. 10 of this, 12 of that, 7 of this, 9 of that. And you always ask, how do they come to that view? And this is particularly true in Buddhism, when you have 12-fold of that and the lotus and all of these sorts of things. But you get it in many, many, many other branches. This list is not exhaustive, right? I'm saying there are many others that I've looked at in the course of writing my book, The Rose from Eritrea. I've looked at Darwin in huge amount of detail. I've looked at George Darwin, his son, who was really interesting in terms of my account of what we can usefully describe as the foundation of epistemology. What is evidence for knowledge? And I think George Darwin, in some ways, goes further than his father. Um, and then, in terms of my degree and my politics, there's lots of people that I've left out: Count Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson, Ralph Miliband, uh, Peter Saunders, loads of people who informed and influenced my own thinking. So, yeah, to answer the email, I'm not qualified. I don't know half the stuff that I've just recounted in detail. I think I'm well read. And I don't retain all the information, right? So I can't, as some people can when they've read something, just reproduce it. Bang, this is what so and so says. I have to go back to it. This is why I've got the list. To be honest with you, the list was set up not to impress or show off or to declare how brilliantly articulate I am and well versed. It's really as a reminder, because I don't remember. So I needed to have a list of things where I could then reflect and go back to the source material in developing my own ideas. So I've done this just to set this scene, as it were, for future podcasts, because I'm answering the email. I did say that if you want to write to me, this is all lowercase, David Stone, David Alexander Stone, sorry, at that outlook.com. I will respond, and that's what I've done. So later, guys.